Museum. A particularly warm welcome to our friends, and also to those on Zoom. We've got about 25 on Zoom tonight, which is tremendous and really good to hear. But an even warmer welcome to Nick Illich, a rifleman with his roots in the Balkans, family roots in the Balkans, who did 3 operational tours in the 1990s in the Balkans. I think the most notable of which was being ADC to General Rose in Sarajevo in 1994, has, in the latter part of his career, from 2018 to 2021, was the DA in Serbia. So I can't think of anybody more qualified to talk to us about the Balkans. Is it still the Powder Keg of Europe? Over to you.
Brigadier, thank you very much. I notice the door is still actually open, and I must make an apology at the start of this presentation, because Brigadier James asked me to do this last year, and when I wrote the synopsis, I said it was the 110th anniversary of the Powder Keg of Europe blowing up. And of course, all the publicity that went out talks about 110 years of Balkan history. I'm actually going to take you back over 2,000 years of history. So if you want to leave, now's your chance in that regard. But really, I mean, you will make the decision whether or not it is still a powder keg, given what's going on around the world. For those of you who are riflemen, there's lots of pictures at the end of the day, so hopefully they'll keep you entertained. But just a bit of background in terms of why are the Balkans viewed traditionally as a powder keg of Europe. Otto von Bismarck in the late 19th century basically said that one day the European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans, because the Balkans have always been a place where empires, cultures, religions collide. And where you have these fault lines, invariably you have problems, hence why it was known as a powder keg. And also, going on from what he said there, it's not worth the blood of a single Pomeranian grenadier. Now, if you know your history, the Pomeranians were the lowest of the low in the Prussian army, and therefore it wasn't even worth their blood. And ultimately, as we all know, in 1914, the powder keg effectively exploded, bringing the great powers into conflict against each other with the Great War in that respect. Because, of course, at that time, we had something called an alliance system. And, of course, the war started in the Balkans because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That brought the Austro-Hungarians into conflict against the Serbs, who were in an alliance with the Russians, who were in alliance with, you get the drift. Basically, everybody was suddenly brought into it in that respect. And I think one of the problems with the Balkans is what Churchill is reputed to have said. You know, they produce more history than they can consume. And therein lies a problem. They can't consume the sheer expanse of history that's been generated over the centuries. And of course, the history to this day is disputed. There isn't, if you speak to 2 people from the Balkans, they'll give you 3 or 4 versions of the history in that regard. And of course, the problem is whoever you speak to will depend on their view of that history. And what they will tell you isn't necessarily the truth. It's what they want you to hear. Now, sometimes, ultimately, we believe that, and that's where the errors are made in terms of diplomacy and everything else. So, why study the Balkans? I don't know if you know this chap called George Busby, lives in very close by in Dorset. He was the first political secretary in Belgrade at the time of the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and some of us served together at that time. And the wife of Slobodan Milosevic, who was always seen as the architect of the collapse of Yugoslavia, died in 1919. And the journalist called Adam Labor wrote a piece about how he was the architect of the collapse of Yugoslavia. And of course, at the time of any conflict, the first people to write books and the accounts are the journalists. Then it's the people who were physically there. Only later in life are diplomats and senior politicians actually able to write actually what happened. And he then contests that less accurate in terms of Adam Labor's article is that identifying Slobodan Milosevic as the architect of the collapse of Yugoslavia. So hang on a second, that's the narrative. So the point is, quite often you have the truth and then you have the narrative, and they're not always the same. And therein lies a problem in the Balkans. And the Balkans in the 1990s, in terms of how that war started and how it was allowed to start, has really set the precedence for all the conflicts since then in many respects. When you look at these pictures of a tank in Croatia or the streets of Sarajevo, how different are they? Not very different to what's going on in Ukraine or in Gaza. But the problem is we've now got used to war. Therein lies a problem. In the 1990s, it was on the news every single day. Now, how often is Ukraine physically on the news? how are we allowing what's going on in Gaza to happen? Why is the international community divided? At least in the 1990s, the Security Council was united. But because of the events in the Balkans, it set a dangerous precedence. And therefore, lo and behold, we have a problem in terms of the international community. Geography-wise, if you don't know, and I know there's someone from the Royal Military Police here, the Balkans are in southeast Europe, and there are the Balkan countries. The word Balkan, it comes from a Turkish word, which is wooded mountains. Not all Balkan countries like to be known as Balkan countries. In fact, within the European and international context, it's also something known as the Western Balkans. And the Western Balkan countries are Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, if you see Kosovo as a country or not, because it's disputed, Republic of North Macedonia, and Albania, i.e. all those countries that aren't in the European Union. So the most westerly Balkan countries, which are Slovenia and Croatia, aren't in the Western Balkans in a political sense. Therein again lies another problem. They're known as Adriatic countries because they actually have a coast on the Adriatic Sea, as does Bosnia, but they're not allowed to be an Adriatic country because they're not in the EU in that regard. So again, labeling and names matter, and therein lies, as I said, a problem. Going back over 2,000 years in terms of a bit of history and geography, the region to the north of the Balkans was populated by the Celts, of all people. So when you look at DNA, they have more in common in some respects with the Scottish than they have in terms of present-day Russia, because the Slavs came later in that regard. To the south of the Celts were the Illyrians, and in terms of the Illyrians, they had many tribes and kingdoms, and something like the kingdom of the Dardanians is something which you might want to sort of remember towards the back end of this presentation, because again, it's the sense of identity is important amongst these people. You'll recognize the kingdom of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, and everything else. Then came the Romans, and of course all these places ceased to exist as kingdoms, and the tribes in many respects were subsumed within the Roman Empire. My family come from what was known as Dalmatia on the Dalmatian coast, although we are ethnic Serbs from Dalmatia, but we didn't see ourselves as Serbs until the war started in Yugoslavia, because we were all Yugoslavs in those days, and then everyone had to have a label because we weren't Croatians, because Croatia declared independence, etc., etc. So there are the Romans, and of course the Roman Empire became too big to manage, and it split in half, the Roman Empire of the West and the Eastern Roman Empire. And of course, the fault line was there in the center, in the Balkans. And of course, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, lo and behold, we then had the Byzantine Empire, which was mainly the Roman Empire of the East in the Balkans, which then eventually expanded to retake some of the territories, including that of Rome in that regard. So that is really history about 2,000 years ago. But the most important event was really starting in the 5th to the 7th century, and that was the migration of the Slavs to the region. This was a major shift in terms of population, and of course, when you look at where the migration starts, it's in present-day Ukraine. And this is why the Ukrainians quite rightly will say that Kyiv is a lot older than Moscow, because of course the Slavic migration went east as well as west as well as south. And this is where your Serbian, your Croatian, your Slovenian tribes kind of arrived in around 6th, 7th century AD into the region and changed the dynamic in that respect. But again, territory is important, particularly in terms of, historic territory. And you can see here on the right-hand side how big Bulgaria was. How big Bulgaria was, absorbing, as we now see, the boundaries of the whole, effectively, of Serbia, the whole of Macedonia, or Republic of North Macedonia. So lo and behold, that was basically the situation in the late 9th century. The Serbs, meanwhile, were relatively small in and around what we now see as Kosovo. Let me just go back slightly. What then happens, lo and behold, is religion becomes a major factor, because many of these tribes then started to convert to Christendom. Okay, and they're all Christian in terms of their faith. But of course, we then have a schism in the Christian church because of the Filioque in terms of the creed of Nicaea. And lo and behold, we now have the Roman Catholic Church predominantly in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church predominantly in the East. And lo and behold, the fault line again is lo and behold in the Balkans. And so look, that's why we have Croatians who are predominantly, in fact, exclusively Roman Catholic, and Serbs, let's say, who are predominantly, but not exclusively, Eastern Orthodox. And therefore, there's this clash of religions that really plays out to this day as well. So religion is an important factor in that regard. You'll see on this map on the left-hand side how all of a sudden Bulgaria suddenly shrinks in size, as does the Byzantine Empire, because the Serbs are now on the ascendancy. And the Serbian Empire in the Middle Ages got down as far as Athens. So vast was it in that regard. But of course, all that was to change when, lo and behold, the Ottomans arrived. In terms of the Serbian Empire, you'll notice in Kosovo today, which is an independent country, this is regarded by the Serbs as their heartland, where most of their cultural and historic sites are physically located, but it's now outside their borders as far as we're concerned in that regard. But then, lo and behold, in the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire began to expand. And the color coding there shows how that empire over the years basically expanded into Europe and also into North Africa, as you can see it there. Very famously, they arrived on this territory in the late 14th century, and we have the Battle of Kosovo on the 28th of June, remember that date, of 1389. Where, lo and behold, Christian armies led by the Serbs basically made a last stand against the Ottomans. They were soundly defeated. This is a painting of a Kosovo maid tending to a fallen Serbian soldier, but so badly mauled were the Turks that they actually returned back into the heartland of the Ottoman Empire and only came back some 50 years later, by which stage the Christian tribes had basically managed to reorganize themselves. The Ottoman Empire started to move towards Vienna, and lo and behold, the likes of Skanderberg, who basically is an Albanian hero, managed to delay the Ottoman Empire's move north along with the Serbs, and therefore the Christian armies were able to defend and save Vienna from falling to the Ottomans in that respect. So the Ottomans had to basically withdraw in that regard. But with the Ottoman occupation, there was all sorts of issues, and great migrations took place. Serbs, for example, from Kosovo moved to the outer extremities of the Ottoman Empire themselves. Many people, in order to have an easier life, converted to Islam, particularly in places like Kosovo today and in Bosnia. That's why we have Muslims, living in the Balkans in that respect. But the Balkans, right up to 1971, was predominantly, in many respects, Christian in terms of Bosnia in that regard. Kosovo now is almost exclusively Albanian, where very few non-Albanians physically located there. But throughout this time, there were rebellions against the Ottomans, and the Ottomans soon became known as the sick man of Europe in that regard. And of course, one of the problems in Europe at that time, very similar to what we have now, are these great powers. And therefore, the balance of power in Europe was fundamental. And therefore, these rebellions against the Ottomans weren't really favored by, dare I say, the Western powers of that time, if I can use that modern term. And every time, of course, they rebelled against the Ottomans, they were brutally repressed. So here we have, for example, after a Christian rebellion by the Holy League in 1690, one of the great migrations of Christians out of Kosovo themselves. We then have another number of major uprisings in the early and late 19th century by the Serbs that really weakens the grip of power in the Balkans from the Ottomans. The Bulgarians are doing exactly the same, as are the Albanians. And so the Ottoman Empire is really struggling in that regard. And again, one of the rebellions was in 1815. This then causes concern amongst, dare I say, Britain, France, and all the rest of it, particularly as Russia now has an important role to play. They saw themselves as Slavs, as the defenders of the Slavs in the Balkans themselves, and saw an opportunity to basically gain ground from the Ottomans, basically in the Balkans themselves. You'll remember, of course, that I mentioned the whole issue of the balance of power. You'll also remember, of course, that Russia is a vast empire. And of course, one of the reasons the first Afghan war started in 1837 was because the Russians tried to go east towards India. And it was their arrival in Afghanistan that led the army from India to march and basically then occupy Afghanistan. And of course, lo and behold, it all went badly wrong in that war. When they failed there, they then tried to occupy lands that are now physically in Romania, Wallachia and Moldavia and all the rest of it. And that's why Britain and France, for the first time since Waterloo, formed an alliance, formed an expeditionary army, and we basically fought the Crimean War because of that, in order to kick the Russians out of Crimea in that respect. That went on for a good couple of years. But the situation in the Balkans around the 1870s was thus great empires. The Ottomans themselves had to accept that the Serbs and the Bulgarians could have some degree of self-rule, and they were therefore made into principalities. But they still were the dominant power, basically in Southeast Europe, but very, very weak. And after the Crimean War ended and the Russians had stopped licking their wounds, they basically tried it again in the 1870s. And then we have the Turkish-Russian War. And what we have there is basically the Turks very much driven out of the lands around Romania, around Bulgaria, and also around Bosnia. And therefore, the Ottoman Empire is in real trouble. And of course, the Balkans people see an opportunity for themselves in terms of them establishing their own empires, which is what they craved. But this would affect the balance of power in Europe. And therefore, the great powers convened the Congress of Berlin of 1878, where the great powers decided what the Balkan nations would have. And there's the problem. It's external interference within the region themselves. And as you can see here on the map, Turkey's hold on the Balkans is greatly basically reduced, moved further south. Serbia gets its independence for the first time, as does Bulgaria. Romania is effectively created. Bosnia sees the Ottoman Empire withdraw from Bosnia, but it's still sovereign territory of the Ottoman Empire. But the Austro-Hungarians themselves administer it on behalf of the Ottomans in that regard. But then in 1908, there's a crisis in Bosnia, and the Austro-Hungarians then formally incorporate it as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. It was an illegal annexation, akin to what the Russians did in Crimea in that regard. The Albanians, meanwhile, or what we now know as Albanians, also tried to get their independence. They created something called the League of Prizren, but again weren't allowed by the Ottomans, and were brutally repressed by the Ottoman Empire in that regard. Russia was frustrated because it wanted a much larger Bulgaria, but wasn't allowed to have that. So Russia really had a huge amount of animosity towards the Western powers, particularly when they weren't able to help the Serbs in Bosnia basically drive the Austro-Hungarians out from controlling their territory. So the Congress of Berlin really was the first external attempt to control affairs in the Balkans themselves. And here we have a cartoon at that time, how Austria-Hungary and Russia really are trying to grab land in the Western Balkans, at the expense of Turkey itself. Typically, lo and behold, the Balkan nations, after a short period of time, decides enough's enough. And they basically then start the First Balkan War of 1812. And this basically sees the Ottoman Empire soundly defeated by the Serbs, the Montenegrins, and by the Bulgarians, along with the Greeks. And lo and behold, again, their ambitions, their view of what territory they should therefore have, again, was curtailed by the European powers. Because lo and behold, for example, Serbia liberated effectively the whole of Albania. The thought of the Serbs having access to the Adriatic coast was abhorrent to the Austro-Hungarians. They feared the fact that, lo and behold, Austro-Hungary, having incorporated the Bosnians, having already had the Slovenians, the Czechs, and the Croats in the empire, now that we have this large, dominant pan-Slavic, movement in Serbia, it would threaten them, and therefore to have a coast would make Serbia even stronger. And of course, Italy always saw the Adriatic coast as their preserve as well. So typically, the Serbs were therefore driven off the coast by the Austrians and the Italians. And of course, the Turks thought maybe there's a chance, if the Europeans squabble between themselves, we've got a second chance in that regard. More importantly, in 1913, again, because the Serbs were driven out of what we now know as Albania, Albania itself got its independence. Again, a creation by the international community. But the problem was, a third of the Albanian population was physically located outside the borders of what is modern Albania in that regard. And even today, we have an issue in the Balkans where there's a movement calling for the unification of all the Albanian lands and the creation of a greater Albania. And so you'll go, not necessarily you'll go to sporting events, but quite often you'll see, when the Albanians are at sporting events, a greater Albanian flag, which, as you can see, would have issues for Greece, would have issues for North Macedonia, would have issues for Serbia and Montenegro in that regard. So lo and behold, treaties are one thing, but if populations aren't satisfied by them, there's always a degree of resentment that results from them. Bulgaria, of course, after the First Balkan Wars, isn't happy at all, because it wanted all of what we now know as North Macedonia. And of course, they then decided to go to war over that issue. And of course, they then were soundly beaten by Serbia and Greece. Romania therefore took more lands. And from that moment on, the Bulgarians have always had an issue with what we now know as Republic of North Macedonia, because they see it very much in their sphere of influence in terms of their people, their culture, their history, and everything else. So lo and behold, even the Balkan countries themselves fell out of favor with each other. And this is why, like I said, the Balkans were seen as a simmering pot, a pressure cooker, a powder keg in terms of what was going on in Europe, because of what they perceived was great power interference in their affairs, at the expense of the former Balkan League. As I mentioned, Austria-Hungary within its empire had now a large Slavic population, and it therefore feared Serbia in terms of trying to unite the Slavs against it. And therefore, the Austro-Hungarians always wanted an excuse to basically resolve the Serbian question, as they refer to it in that regard. Of course, Germany was there very much preventing Russia from any influence in the region, which caused animosity amongst the Russians themselves. So as we know, the powder keg effectively exploded following an event on the 28th of June of 1914. Remember, the 28th of June was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and therefore the arrival of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo was seen as a provocation by the Bosnian Serbs and also other members of the Bosnian community, and therefore he was basically shot dead in Sarajevo. But there's more to this story than meets the eye. It's actually a love story, because I don't know if you know the story about the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was never supposed to be the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His cousin was supposed to be the son of Franz Joseph. He committed suicide for various reasons, and lo and behold, he then became the heir apparent. But he didn't marry into royalty. He married into aristocracy. And Sophie was an aristocrat from Bohemia. And therefore, before he could actually accept to be Archduke, he had to renounce the Austro-Hungarian throne going forward. And that renouncing took place on the 28th of June, 1900. So this was therefore the 14th anniversary of that event. And because she wasn't royalty and she was an aristocrat, she couldn't appear alongside the Archduke at any formal Austro-Hungarian event. She had to be at the back. Only in his military capacity could she be by his side. And this, therefore, this visit to Sarajevo was on the anniversary of them renouncing the throne, not only for his children, but also out of love. And sadly, on that day, they were both shot by an assassin. And lo and behold, what we therefore have is this, the alliance system now pulling against each other, and the war basically begins. And the Balkans themselves during the war suffered heavily. I mean, if you look at Serbia, for example, 56% of the Serb male population perished in the Great War. A third of the population of Serbia perished in the Great War. 75% of their soldiers had become casualties. Huge, because of the nature of the fighting and everything that went on there. Bulgaria saw it as an opportunity to reclaim its lost ground in North Macedonia. Romania remained neutral, but then eventually attacked Austria-Hungary and Germany, but then was soundly defeated by them in that regard. The Serbs, in the end, having defeated 3 invasions by the Austro-Hungarians, were then effectively driven out when Bulgaria entered the war, along with the invasion by the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans in October of 1915. And because of that invasion, Serbia was occupied. That allowed the Berlin to Constantinople railway to be unhindered, and therefore the whole Gallipoli campaign effectively collapsed, because ultimately the Germans were able to easily resupply the Ottomans in that regard. But the whole Serbian army, or what was left of it, retreated over the mountains of Montenegro and Albania to Corfu, where they're reconstituted by the British and French. It's an amazing story in many regards, and I suppose another talk at some detail, which has a huge amount of British interest in it. Over 1,000 women went to Serbia's aid as nurses, as auxiliaries, and as doctors, the likes of the Scottish Women's Hospital, Serbian Relief Fund, the likes of Mabel Stobart, Elizabeth Ross. So when we have role models amongst women, in terms of what women can do in war, this campaign is certainly one of them. In fact, the only Western woman to fight as a soldier in the Great War was a British woman called Flora Sands from Yorkshire of Irish descent, who fought alongside the Serbs in the war and earned the Serbian version of the Victoria Cross themselves. They then joined a coalition in Salonika. There was the British, the French, the Greeks, the Italians at some stage, the Russians until the revolution, and effectively a 5-nation coalition against the Ottomans, against the Bulgarians, against the Austro-Hungarians and Germans. And effectively, it was the advance out to the Macedonian front, the Salonika front, that made the Germans realize that when the Ottomans were kicked out of the war, when the Austro-Hungarians were defeated, that effectively, come November, they had no option but to basically sign the armistice, as we know, on the 11th of November. Very much a forgotten front, because it takes away from the sacrifices that took place from our perspective on the Western Front. And so the Salonika army, which was quite large in many respects, is very much a forgotten army in that regard. But out of the ashes of the Great War was a new kingdom created, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. that was then endorsed by the Treaty of Versailles, as we all basically know. And this was therefore established under the Serbian king, because the Serbs emerged on the victorious side, the Slovenians, the Croatians, and the Bosnians who fought alongside the Austro-Hungarians clearly lost. But basically, it was the idea of uniting all the Slavic people together in a single kingdom, not to be dominated by external powers. And of course, if you look at this map in terms of color coding, blue is effectively where the Serbs lived. The browny sort of orangey color are the Slovenes to the northwest and the Croatians. And any green colors you see there are Muslims, either from Bosnia or from what we now know as Kosovo in that regard. And anything white is no majority. So it's a patchwork of nations that are brought basically together. But the term the Kingdom of Serbs, Slovenes, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was in itself seen as divisive. Well, where are the Bosnians in that title? Where are the North Macedonians as we now know them? Where are the Albanians in that title? They're not there. And therefore, when King Peter died and King Alexander became king, he basically renamed it as the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Southern, Yug means south, Southern Slavs. And all was good, theoretically, but of course it wasn't, on the grounds that people wanted to actually not be dominated still by the Serbs, particularly the Slovenes and the Croats themselves, who for the whole of the occupation by Ottomans were part of Western empires. They saw themselves as cultured, unlike the peasant Serbs, who were now basically holding the whip hand in that regard. So there's always tensions throughout that. In fact, King Alexander was assassinated in Marseille in 1936 by a Bulgarian hired by a Croat fascist movement known as Ustashi. And lo and behold, a royal dictatorship prior to that and after, therefore, it was established. 1939, Second World War basically starts, as we all know. Yugoslavia remained neutral and was the last country to be forced to sign the tripartite pact. In terms of basically being not necessarily allied, but basically on the side of the Axis. And really, when that pact was signed by the government, the Serbs in Belgrade and elsewhere throughout Serbia rejected the plan. And as a result of that, Hitler launched on the 6th of April 1941, Operation Punishment, the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, because it's important for Hitler to have Yugoslavia within his realm of influence. Why? Communications down to Greece in order to support Rommel's army in North Africa, but also to make sure that his rear was secure for the forthcoming operation for the invasion of the Soviet Union, Barbarossa. And because of the invasion of Yugoslavia, that delayed Operation Barbarossa by 6 weeks. And of course, the Germans didn't get to Moscow by that winter. So again, strategically important in terms of what went on there. But the Second World War was an absolute disaster for the Yugoslav people themselves. Yugoslavia was dismembered. As you can see here in the south, a greater Albania was effectively created under Italian domination in the south. The Croatians established an independent state of Croatia. They had a policy of killing a third of the Serb population, converting a third of the population, and then what was left was to be expelled. So genocide on the grand scale was basically taking place. And many anti-Serb elements, like let's say in this picture here in Albania, or in this case the Bosnians, were eager recruits to the German ranks in that respect. And therefore atrocities occurred on all sides. It was a brutal civil war. When we think about the civil war in Yugoslavia and the war in total, when we think about casualties, at the end of the Second World War, clearly the Soviet Union had the greatest amount, followed by Nazi Germany, followed by the Polish Jews, followed by the Yugoslavs. More Yugoslavs were killed than the combined total of American, British, and French total war casualties, military and civilian. And of course, here, the war was motivated by fear, hate, and revenge, something that was to be carried forward into the 1990s themselves. It was a brutal, brutal civil war. There were two resistance movements, the first created by mainly Serbian royalists under Mihailovic, the second after the invasion of the Soviet Union under the communists of Josip Broz Tito. And of course, we know in terms of what went on there, the accounts of the likes of Fitzroy and Maclean kind of give a vivid picture of events. In fact, he was supported by two able riflemen, both Special Forces officers, Vivian Street and also John Henniker Major in that respect. But of course, the problem is it was also a propaganda war. How do we, be the royalists or the communists, get Allied support to be able to not only survive, but defeat our enemies? On the left, they wanted to maintain the status quo at the end of the war, a royal kingdom. On the right, a social revolution. The two resistance movements were diametrically opposed, and therefore they killed more of each other than the Germans. This chap here, Archie Jack, who was a member of Force 133 of the Special Operations Executive, said something that is true to this day. If you can't read it, it says, the Yugoslavs were nice people, but you could never believe anything they said to you. Those in Maclean's mission believed every word the Yugoslavs said to them. The partisans would say, we have this, we hold that, we did this, we did that. But of course, none of it was verified by British officers. We, in his mission, did not. We prefer to see for ourselves. They, the BLOs, British liaison officers who were the partisans, never actually participated in planned operations, and political commissars were assigned to look after them. So lo and behold, it was a war of propaganda and deceit in many respects. The view from Bletchley Park, and Gene Howard was one of those who was required to produce a weekly report to Churchill, basically said that most of the well-known documentation that was provided for us to change our policies from supporting the royalists to supporting the partisans actually came from partisan sources. And therefore our switch of support was mainly because of the acceptance of communist propaganda. And of course, all these things to this day now divide the societies even more. What happened in the Second World War? Why is the narrative of the war now contested? And there's a huge amount of revision of the narrative going on, which therefore divides society. But ultimately, the communists came out on top. But of course, for Churchill, it was all about realpolitik. Because, of course, once the Americans had decided that they wouldn't invade in the Balkans, would instead invade in Italy, Churchill knew that the Red Army would arrive in the Balkans before the Allied armies from the West. And lo and behold, in Moscow in 1944, he and Stalin basically agreed to carve up the Balkans, as you can see there. Romania, 90% going to the Russians, 10% to effectively Western influence. Greek would be 90% Western influence, 10% to the Russians. Yugoslavia would be a 50-50 split. Hungary would also be a 50-50 split. And Bulgaria would be 75% Russian, 25% Western influence. But of course, the Russians, when they got there, or the Soviets, when they got there, just took everything. And we lost all influence in the region itself. So that was basically how modern Yugoslavia prior to the 1990s was effectively born. Tito himself wanted a greater Yugoslavia, which incorporated Bulgaria and Romania, but didn't have his way. And therefore, he created a country of 6 republics. Slovenia in the northwest, followed by Croatia, followed by Bosnia and Herzegovina in the center, Serbia in the east, Montenegro in the southwest, and Macedonia there in the southeast. And of course, as you can see there, Serbia itself was divided also into 3, with 2 autonomous or provinces that rule themselves, one in Vojvodina, because there's a large Hungarian minority there, and also because of the large Albanian population in Kosovo. Basically, that was also an autonomous province. But of course, the likes of the Albanians, who always wanted their own independence and wanted to be a republic in their own right, were never given that right by the communists in that respect. And therefore, resentment almost from the outset began to basically dominate. The world, of course, during the Cold War wasn't a peaceful place. And we all know about the Prague Spring and what was going on in Hungary, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and of course the invasion of Cyprus. And that therefore resulted in another conference taking place. And of course it was known as the Helsinki Conference, and the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 was therefore agreed by the Western and Eastern powers, where effectively we all agreed in terms of the international rules-based order that in addition to the UN Charter, we would have the Helsinki Accord, where effectively we all recognise the sovereignty of states, the fact that all borders were not to be basically, changed by force, and no external influence in the internal affairs of what countries allowed, and therefore that we would respect the territorial integrity of states. Everything that we're now saying should be applied to Ukraine, because Russia has broken all these acts in terms of not only the UN Charter, but also the Helsinki Final Act in that respect. But Yugoslavia, when Tito died, began to disintegrate. As far as Tito was concerned, he was Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia was effectively Tito. He didn't leave a natural successor, and therefore they had a revolving presidency, which worked to a certain degree. But of course, for the Albanians, particularly in Kosovo, they now feared domination by the Serbs without the guardian who how they saw Tito. And in 1980, as soon as he died, already there were rebellions breaking out in the Serbian province of Kosovo, viciously put down by the Yugoslavs by bringing the Slovenians over from Slovenia to do it, because they also hated the Kosovars, because Kosovo was a poor region of Yugoslavia, and the Slovenians and the Croatians particularly resented the fact that their wealth that they were generating through tourism, for example, was bailing out the poor areas of Yugoslavia like Kosovo in that respect. And all you've got to do is really read this, that Tito wrote, because of the Second World War, that we have spilt an ocean of blood for the brotherhood and unity of our peoples, and we shall not allow anyone to touch or destroy it from within. And therefore, this is why any attempt to basically destroy Yugoslavia at that time was going to be brutally repressed. And of course, lo and behold, it all started when, lo and behold, the Iron Curtain came down. And the guardians of Yugoslavia were always going to be the Yugoslav National Army, the fourth largest army in Europe at that time. But it was an army designed to defend Yugoslavia. And every month they would train against a NATO invasion and then against an invasion by the Warsaw Pact. It was never designed to basically, fight within itself in that regard. So lo and behold, when the Iron Curtain came down, 1989, for the Berlin Wall, and all these countries of the former Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, got their independence whether they liked it or not. When the revolutions took place in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Hungary and elsewhere, the Yugoslav peoples rightly questioned, why do we now need to stay part of this Yugoslav state that we don't want to be part of in that regard? And Yugoslavia was therefore inevitably going to break up. But of course, if Yugoslavia broke up, what about the ethnic division of territory? Because of course, the boundaries of Yugoslavia in terms of the republics were created by Tito in 1943 at a meeting in a place called Jajce. And therefore, if it didn't break up peacefully in accordance with the rules-based order, it was always going to be a hell of a civil war, as one US diplomat was to describe. So what we therefore saw in Yugoslavia was the rise of nationalism based on some mythical identity politics of the past. And in this picture here of Milosevic in Kosovo, he was warning the Serbs of what was coming. The fact that Yugoslavia was about to be dismembered, the external, internal forces trying to destroy it, and they have to be prepared for a battle itself. So lo and behold, this is why, lo and behold, George Bovsey was prompted to write his article in the Financial Times, because what he said quite rightly, that while Milosevic was undoubtedly guilty of many crimes, there were more important factors that led to the disintegration of Yugoslavia. A widespread popular rejection of centrist power in Belgrade by distant republics, Slovenia, Croatia, and ultimately Bosnia. The emergence of right-wing politicians in some of those republics who basically use nationalism in order to gain votes and everything else. The misuse of referendums as a source of political legitimacy, i.e. they had a referendum which was legitimate and the very next day declared independence without any negotiation in terms of what independence would look like. If we look at the referendum in Bosnia in 1992, actually it wasn't constitutional on the grounds that yes, 90% of the people voted for independence, but less than 2/3 of the people actually voted in the referendum. They needed more than 2/3 of the people to vote for it to become legal, but they declared independence in any case. So no wonder Bosnia also went to war. But more importantly, this identity politics based on some romantic vision of the past in terms of what territory was about. This idea of irredentism, where effectively, it was all about getting our historic territory. But as you saw in the earlier part of the talk itself, the borders changed constantly throughout history, and therefore everybody claimed each other's territory. And therein lies the problem, which is still very much the problem of today in terms of this identity politics based on some national or historic or ethnic affiliation in that regard. So lo and behold, we had these wars of independence where the Yugoslav National Army tried to keep Yugoslavia together. Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Albanians, whoever deserted from that army, and effectively the Yugoslav National Army became a Serbian army. And therefore, the vision of a greater Serbia was being touted by many. This is what they were basically fighting for. And at that time, of course, the media was let loose. Prior to the wars in Yugoslavia, if you remember how the media was very tightly controlled, even during the Gulf War, now we had the media able to basically roam around. Technology allowed, certainly from 1993, 94 onwards, satellite technology to beam the pictures directly to the newsrooms, whereas previous to that, it had to be done from television stations. And therefore, the scenes, let's say, of Dubrovnik, where there were expensive yachts burning in the harbors, that gave the impression that Dubrovnik was on fire, caused revulsion, as you can imagine on our screens. Concentration concentration camps were also established by all sides. And again, was this going back to the horrors of the Second World War? And it was also then seen, because the Serbs had the majority of the heavy weaponry, as a David versus Goliath struggle in that regard. So, who was to blame? Who was right or who was wrong? Well, the Secretary of State of the United States at that time was a chap called James Baker. And he's on record and saying, Yugoslavia broke up because of the unilateral declarations of independence by Slovenia and Croatia and the seizing by these two republics of their border posts, which was an act of force and an act in violation of the Helsinki principles. But the European powers and the United States ultimately recognized Slovenia, then Croatia, and then Bosnia as independent states and admitted them to the United Nations, rather than a peaceful negotiation of independence, which is what should have happened. So the way in which Yugoslavia broke up was against the rules-based order. And it was the fact that Western countries like Germany and Austria precipitated that was the problem. Countries like ourselves, Britain, and particularly also Canada, were against the breakup of Yugoslavia because we knew the history and we knew what a breakup in that terms would cause. But ultimately, in order to maintain European unity and for ourselves to get concessions out of the Germans over Maastricht, we went along with the German plan to recognize these republics, and ultimately that was to lead to war in itself. And as we mentioned already, all the different aspects of the Helsinki Accords were therefore ignored. And therefore, when we talk about the rules-based order and how it's being breached absolutely by the Russians at the moment, this is the precedence that we regrettably set that allowed the Russians to simply take the playbook and exploit it for themselves in that regard. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see some of the things that are happening now in Eastern Europe that really have their roots in the Balkans themselves. This is what the Canadian ambassador at the time in Belgrade said, and this view was shared by our ambassador. It was the most misrepresented war in modern history. The Western media identified very early on that the Serbs started the war, the Serbs committed all the atrocities, and the Serbs did all the so-called ethnic cleansing. And of course, this was a gross misrepresentation. They didn't start the war, well, that's debatable. They did not want to cede from Yugoslavia, and the ethnic cleansing and atrocities were committed on all sides. But we turned a blind eye to the atrocities of the people that we were supporting, i.e. the Slovenes, the Croats, and ultimately the Bosniaks themselves. And therefore, in order to make them who were theoretically wrong, according to the rules-based order, right, we had to demonstrate that the people who theoretically were right, the Yugoslavs, otherwise known as the Serbs, were therefore wrong, which was very easy to do if you didn't turn a blind eye to their atrocities. And like I said, the problem with the wars in Yugoslavia, they were motivated by hate, fear, and revenge. It was this vicious circle that basically continued from 2,000 years ago and continues regrettably to this day in itself. The first force commander of the UN mission in Yugoslavia, an Indian general, wrote, portraying the Serbs as evil and everybody else as good was not only counterproductive, but also dishonest. According to my experience, all sides were guilty, but only the Serbs, interestingly, would admit that they were no angels, while the others would insist that they were. Everybody saw themselves as the victim. And of course, the narrative that the Serbs are bad and everybody else is good is a narrative that continues to this day. And therefore, that's why you have problems, particularly now with the Serbs. Because when they look at the war, they look at it through a different lens completely in terms of how it all started and what happened to their population to that of, let's say, the Croats, the Bosnian Muslims, now known as Bosniaks, the Albanians and the like. And therefore you have different versions of the story. And that's why reconciliation is so difficult in the region to this day. And these problems basically continue. The Americans, of course, had an agenda, particularly over the recognition of Bosnia's independence, because given what went on in the Middle East with the first Gulf War, they wanted to show the Muslim world that we cared for them. And therefore, they then provided a huge amount of support, moral support to the Bosnian Muslims. But when we were there, some of the guys in the room with me, this was really, the extent of the territory that the Serbs controlled. A third of Croatia, roughly 70% of Bosnia, and clearly the whole of Yugoslavia, including Kosovo in that regard. And lo and behold, when you then compare that with the ethnic distribution of who sat where, it was particularly similar in that regard. Although areas, for example, like Kosovo, predominantly dominated by Albanians, and in eastern Bosnia, as you can see there, dominated by Muslims. So the front lines roughly match, but not entirely, where people traditionally lived anyway in that regard. But ultimately, the war had to be brought to a close, not because of the fighting, but because of a an American agenda in many respects. President Clinton was coming up for re-election. He therefore wanted to end the war, and therefore events conspired, the Srebrenica massacre, etc., that resulted in NATO bombing the Serbs after an event on the 28th of August. The bombing started on the 30th and would last on until the middle of September. And basically, the American and NATO bombing combined with an offensive by the Croats and the Muslims to basically drive the Serbs back to a point on the ground where they only now controlled 49% of the territory in Bosnia. That's when effectively the fighting stopped. Why 49%? Because that was the agreement that basically had already been agreed amongst the Western nations of a split of Bosnia, 51% to the Bosnians and Croats, 49% to the Serbs. And amazingly, that's where the front lines basically froze. And as a result of that, a conference was held in Dayton, Ohio, in the United States, between the 1st and 21st of November, where effectively the wars in Croatia and in Bosnia were brought to an end. Huge lessons to be learned in terms of what peace could look like in places like Ukraine and Gaza and the like. And be careful what you wish for. You'll see here in this picture, you probably don't recognize them, but President Izetbegovic represented the Bosnian Muslims. He was their leader. The Croats in Bosnia and Croatia were represented by the Croatian president, not the leader of the Bosnian Croats. And Milosevic, who led the Serbs in Yugoslavia, represented the Bosnian Serbs. And therefore, the Bosnian Serbs themselves didn't have a vote at the table in terms of what the peace would effectively look like. Throughout the war, we said, as we are now saying to Ukraine, we will not allow a division of territory in Bosnia. Bosnia had to become, at the end of the war, a single sovereign state with its own territorial integrity. But this division of 51-49% was a factor. And in order to get peace, basically the Bosnian Muslims were forced to accept this plan, where effectively the country was then divided into two, where effectively in the middle in blue was a federation made up of Croats and Muslims, and there in the pink basically was territory that the Bosnian Serbs would effectively control, which went against all the principles that we said throughout the war. So when we hear now about the fact that we won't allow the Russians to have any piece of territory in any final settlement in Ukraine, that's exactly what we were saying in Bosnia. But realpolitik ultimately comes to the fore in that regard. The Bosnian Serbs themselves weren't happy at all with the plan in many respects. And since that peace was signed, they resist any change to the Dayton Accord. The Bosnian Muslims didn't want the plan because it divided Bosnia as far as they were concerned and gave the Serbs territory, as far as they were concerned, rewards aggression. Izetbegovic said, this might not be a just peace, but it's a beginning effectively. So ever since the signing of the Dayton Peace Accord, they've been trying to change it, which therefore is resisted by the Bosnian Serbs. And as our own Paddy Ashdown basically said, the Dayton Peace Agreement was a superb agreement to end the war, but a bad one to make a state. And of course, we've got a huge amount we can learn from how that came about in terms of what peace in Ukraine, let's say, could potentially look at. Don't worry about the detail, but Bosnia now is the most complicated political system in the whole of Europe. It is deliberately designed to be dysfunctional, where one people can veto effectively the actions of another if it doesn't suit their purpose in that regard. To put things simply, Bosnia itself, in terms of central institutions, are relatively weak. All the power is held in the two entities. Each entity has its own president, but Bosnia itself has a rotating, has three presidents represented by the three constituents people: the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosniaks. But what happens if you're not a Serb, a Croat, or a Bosniak? Well, you can't actually be represented. That means you can't go for office in Bosnia. So the lessons from the 1920s, why the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was changed to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, were not taken forward in modern-day Bosnia. And Bosnia to this day is absolutely dysfunctional because all the power theoretically rests in the entities as opposed to the central institutions. And we've realized that is wrong. And therefore, we are trying, in terms of the Western community, to change the Dayton plan to make central government stronger, which, of course, has been resisted by the Serbs throughout. And therefore, the limitations, as I said, of Dayton Accord have really lessons that resonate towards the future. But the biggest problem with the Dayton Accord, while it stopped the conflict in Croatia, stopped the conflict in Bosnia, the issue in Kosovo, particularly Albanians, was seen as an internal matter and was therefore parked in that respect. So to this day, Bosnia is very much divided. Mostar, the most divided city in the whole of Bosnia, where the Croats and the Muslims simply do not get together. Schools are physically divided, two different curriculums. And if they have to share the same school, they're on different corridors or different floors. They simply, cannot exist together in many respects themselves. The wounds of Bosnia are still very, very raw. And every year on anniversaries, those wounds are opened up. There's no reconciliation amongst the communities, only really tension in that respect. War criminals in one area are regarded as heroes, clearly war criminals in other areas. And of course, there's no justice for some victims. So, for example, the commanders of the Croatian army who drove 250,000 Serbs out of Croatia, or Nasser Oric, who killed thousands of Serbs around Srebrenica, all acquitted of any war crimes. And yet we knew they committed horrendous war crimes. But of course, we supported them. And therefore, that would potentially implicate us in those deeds. And therefore, there's no justice for some victims, even though in death, ultimately, we're all the same. And therefore, Bosnia, every year, particularly around elections or anniversaries, finds itself in a real state of crisis that causes problems for the international community, which wasn't a problem before what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East now. The Serbs themselves absolutely want basically to separate from Bosnia. Of course, we're not allowing that because we want to make sure the territorial integrity of Bosnia is maintained. But as we'll see later, Kosovo was allowed to separate from Serbia, even though under international law, it's still part of Serbia. And therefore, it's really, really complex. The High Representative, effectively a viceroy in Bosnia, which Paddy Ashdown was at one stage, his position was not endorsed by the Security Council because of the Russian veto. And therefore, the Bosnian Serbs refused to accept any of his actions in Bosnia that might change the way in which Bosnia effectively looks. And therefore, the president of the Serbs at the moment has been jailed effectively for a year. He didn't go to jail. He appealed that sentence. He was acquitted of that sentence, but he's been barred from office. And there's a crisis now in Bosnia whereby, having been barred for office, the Serbs now want to organize a referendum, to confirm that he should be their leader. And also in October, remember that date of this year, also a referendum on independence. Whether that will take place, we don't know. But it's going to continue this cycle of tension in the region itself. And of course, all this plays into the hands, particularly of the Russians, because in their own backyard in Europe, they have a huge amount of influence to be able to disrupt our Euro-Atlantic goals within the region itself. So Bosnia absolutely is a place what we need to watch going forward, and is still to this day a tinderbox. But Kosovo is exactly the same. Big issues in Kosovo, which are worth really highlighting. During the war itself in the 1990s, very, very quiet in Kosovo. Very little actually went on, mainly because actually they had a Gandhi-style movement which basically sought to gain their independence through peaceful means. But ultimately, what changed things was effectively a civil war in Albania, where a pyramid scheme, financial scheme, absolutely collapsed. Thousands of weapons were liberated from arms dumps, and many of these weapons basically found their way north of the border into Yugoslavia, into the hands of a shadowy organization known as the Kosovo Liberation Army. And they basically then began an armed resistance against the Yugoslav security forces with a view of getting independence in that regards. The Yugoslav police couldn't cope. The army effectively was brought in, and effectively all-out war was almost effectively taking place on the ground itself. Now, initially, the KLA were a prescribed terrorist organization, and they used terrorist methods that we'd all recognize to try and get their way. And this was even endorsed by the Americans themselves. Interestingly, one of the negotiators at the peace talks that took place in February of 1999 said, an American diplomat said, unless you can pass the quota of 5,000 deaths, you'll never have anybody permanently present in Kosovo. So there was a price for international intervention. Interestingly, when we were in Bosnia in the 1990s, exactly the same thing was said to the people of Srebrenica. If you can get the Serbs to kill 5,000 people in Srebrenica, you'll get international intervention. And that came from the chief of police. So that is the price for intervention in the Balkans in that regard. And lo and behold, as the fighting escalated, we had a humanitarian crisis on our hands, as thousands of people on both sides basically had to flee the fighting in that regard. International observers were basically sent into Kosovo. An agreement of sorts was signed. The Yugoslav army pulled out of Kosovo. But of course, how do you police that with what were effectively terrorists, the KLA? And therefore, they didn't see that agreement worthy, and therefore they moved back into positions that they previously occupied, and the fighting effectively continued in that regard. As I said, that the peace talks were held in February of 1999. But as late as the middle of January 1999, Robin Cook, who was our foreign secretary, interestingly said, on its part, the Kosovo Liberation Army has committed more breaches of the ceasefire and until this weekend responsible for more deaths than the security forces. But of course, the image that we were getting back in let's say, at home was that the Serbs were the ones carrying out all the crimes and all the killings. But the reality on the ground was very different. It was a very murky situation. What the French defense minister basically said as the main destabilizing factor in Kosovo at that time wasn't the Serbs, it was the KLA. When you look at some of the reports that came out of the observer missions on the grounds themselves, this from a German who was actually in Kosovo, you know, as far as he was concerned, the Serbian security forces demonstrate remarkable restraint and discipline, but that's not the impression that we were getting. Yes, there was fighting going on. Yes, they were attacking civilians who were supporting the KLA, but you go from one village to the next, one will be destroyed, the other wouldn't be destroyed in that regard. But the fighting was taking place on all sides. And interestingly, what the media and with no less intensive politicians were claiming wasn't necessarily the case on the ground. And therefore, we have, again, to this day, because of the reality on the ground, the tension between the two communities, the different narratives of what went on in the war itself. There was then a peace agreement effectively put on the table in France at Rambouillet, where effectively Kosovo would get its autonomy back. But unfortunately for those who were there, the KLA insisted on full independence, which was supported by the Americans. And the Americans are also insisting that NATO basically not only went into Kosovo, but had jurisdiction over the whole of Yugoslavia. And of course, this would mean a loss of sovereignty to Yugoslavia, knowing full well that the Yugoslavs would never sign such an agreement. In fact, the godfather of American diplomacy, Henry Kissinger, said, ultimately, Rambouillet was not a document that any angelic Serb could have accepted. It was a terrible document that should never have been presented in that format, because effectively, it was a document that would lead to war in that respect. And of course, that's exactly what happened. On the 24th of March through to the 10th of June, NATO launched a 78-day bombing mission. And we now hear how Russia describes its invasion of Ukraine as a special military operation. General Wesley Clark, who was secure at that time, basically said it wasn't a war. So Russia is using a similar phrase, i.e., it's not a war in Ukraine, it's a special military operation. In fact, it wasn't. There wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't legally a war, so it actually was an illegal war. And of course, Russia is exploiting this in many respects in that regard, which again is an issue for us in terms of how do we counter them. But as soon as the bombing started, tens of thousands of refugees effectively fled Kosovo because of the fighting, because of retaliation, particularly by Serb paramilitaries, because of the bombing. Nobody wanted to be where the bombs also fell, but also because of the KLA encouraged the Kosovo Albanians to leave to make sure that basically NATO had the free-for-all around Kosovo in terms of bombing the Yugoslav National Army, who had hid itself amongst the population themselves. And the bombing basically was only planned to last for about 3 days. They were absolutely convinced that Milosevic would fall, but it went on for 78 days. And in the end, we had to go to Russia in order to bail out NATO in that regard. And the agreement that was put on the table then in June of 1999 was very similar to what the Serbs would have agreed in Rambouillet. But when the Americans came in talking about full independence, clearly that was unacceptable. Now, there wouldn't be a NATO force on the ground. It would be a UN force, which NATO would provide a substantial part of, still to this day known as KFOR. But importantly for the Yugoslavs and therefore the Serbs, that Kosovo would remain part of Yugoslavia, which was great for the Serbs. They therefore withdrew. It was bad for the Albanians who wanted independence in that regard. And therefore, lo and behold, people were able to leave. But there was a huge amount of tension going on because as the Albanians came back in, the Serbs feared for their lives in many respects. And therefore, tens of thousands of Serbs were therefore driven out of Kosovo. And again, horrendous scenes were once again repeated. At the moment in Kosovo, there's about 3,500 troops from different nations, the vast majority from NATO. It's NATO's largest mission in the world, bizarrely. And the majority of the time, they're not only trying to suppress any tension, but also safeguard what's left of the Serb population on the ground itself. So what? Serbs were out, but it was still part of Serbia. Even in 2003, in the first Western Balkans summit in Thessaloniki, EU countries basically reaffirmed their view of the inviolability of international borders, therefore that Serbia still had Kosovo within its powers, which the Albanians clearly weren't happy about. So lo and behold, in 2004, violence returned to Kosovo. And since then, it's been a continuing drumbeat of violence as one side or another isn't happy with what's going on in that respect. And therefore, it is a problem, particularly as NATO's forces reduced in terms of numbers. In 2008, the people of Kosovo declared independence and very quickly recognized by ourselves, Turkey, the Americans, Britain, and roughly half of the world's population. In 2010, the International Court of Justice was asked the question, was Kosovo's declaration of independence a breach of international law? And the verdict was no, because declarations of independence in their own right aren't illegal. So we therefore took that, understandably, as Kosovo's therefore independence. But the ICJ didn't say, therefore Kosovo is an independent country, because there's other factors that are important. And the problem now for Kosovo is we see it as independent, half the world's population sees it as independent, but the other half effectively doesn't. And importantly, Serbia refuses to recognize its independence. As soon as this happened, Russia invaded Georgia, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia were therefore seized. They declared independence. And lo and behold, the Russians said, well, if it's good for Kosovo, it's good for us here. They use exactly the same precedents in the Donbass and also in Crimea. So you can see how what goes on in Yugoslavia has a ripple effect around the world in that regard. So even in Europe, we're divided. NATO members, some NATO members, Spain, Greece, Romania, don't recognize Kosovo's independence. EU members, for example, Greece and Cyprus, don't also recognize Kosovo's independence. So the world is divided. Kosovo's aspirations to join NATO and the EU are basically being thwarted by EU and NATO members who don't recognize its independence, because those countries have their own internal problems with the Basque, the Catalans, and the Turkish Cypriots and the like. And therefore, the world is effectively divided. Attempts to try and normalize relations between the Serbs and the Kosovars have also basically failed. An agreement was made in 2013 where effectively the Serb areas here in blue would have a certain degree of autonomy. That hasn't happened. And that plays into the Serbian narrative of the Kosovars aren't adhering to agreements that they've effectively signed. Kosovars aren't supposed to go into those Serb areas, for example, with long-barrel weapons. And lo and behold, that then started to happen from 2018 onwards. This saw the mobilization and deployment of Serbian army elements onto the border with Kosovo, fearing that violence would return and their population would be driven out. And that happens on a regular basis in that regard. In 2023, the Serbs pulled themselves out of all institutions in Kosovo because of an issue with the Kosovar Albanians. This led to riots, and interestingly, the EU and the Americans, instead of blaming the Serbs, blamed the Albanians in Kosovo for the provocations that resulted in that violence. And therefore, the Kosovars are frustrated because, hang on a second, the Serbs are doing this, but we're the ones under sanctions. Issues clearly between the population themselves. In the same year, 2023, Serb paramilitaries led by the vice president of the main Serbian political party were caught smuggling weapons into Kosovo. One policeman was killed, 3 Serbs were killed in the firefight that ensued. And again, this also raised tensions. So Kosovo, like Bosnia, has massive issues. And the problem for Kosovo, however, is the fact that it's an unresolved issue. It's a frozen conflict in many regards. Kosovo is independent, but not, depending on where you sit and your view and all the rest of it. It's got the youngest population in Europe, but significant unemployment, and people are leaving in their droves. And therefore, that in itself is destabilizing. And as long as Serbia refuses to accept Kosovo's independence, it's never going to be effectively at peace. And the current government is particularly intransigent. In fact, they had elections in February, and they still haven't been able to form a government because of infighting amongst the different political parties. Only a couple of days ago did they finally elect a speaker for parliament that allows a new government to be formed. And the current government is basically it's got 14 days to form a government, but it's unlikely to do so because of the infighting amongst different political parties. Kosovo is clearly still under sanctions from the EU, and there's obviously concern amongst the Kosovo Albanian population, given what's going on about the commitments of the international community to Kosovo and also to Bosnia in many regards, who are dependent on international aid and money coming through. Add to that problems of the Kosovo leaders from the war, all effectively being in the War Crimes Tribunal. If they're found guilty, would cause massive issues to the Albanian population. If they're exonerated, massive issues for the Serbs. And therefore, that is also a place of tension. And therefore, as we can see here, NATO is really concerned about the ongoing situation in Kosovo, which simply isn't on the news, because what goes on in Ukraine and in Gaza dominates, and yet it's literally at the end of our nose, physically in Europe themselves. So Is it still a powder keg? You know, I think you can draw your own conclusions in that regard. One of the problems I think it is because in any stable democracy, that stable democracy has been created because probably of a brutal war of some sort that has basically resulted in a victory by one side against another. The problem is all the problems in particularly Yugoslavia are in those areas where the war was stopped but didn't end. And therefore an agreement was signed that has probably been changed since that agreement was signed, which causes all sorts of problems. You know, yes, stability brings peace, particularly in terms of NATO or the EU. But if we look at, for example, North Macedonia, they had massive issues trying to join NATO and trying to start EU accession because their country was called the Republic of Macedonia, which the Greeks were against. So an agreement then was made that they would be called the Republic of North Macedonia, which was acceptable. But now the Bulgarians, who see, you know, massive issues in North Macedonia in terms of its own people, are now thwarting their accession to the EU because of the right, effectively, to have the right to self-determination in that regard. So even NATO members are fighting between themselves in the Balkans themselves, let alone in terms of what's going on in the EU. Serbia is still a problem in terms of it's military neutral and it's non-aligned. It's a powerhouse because it plays the EU off with the Russians, with the Americans, with the Chinese, with anybody, and therefore is now a European powerhouse in terms of the economy and is rapidly expanding. And therefore this area is contested space. It's the last bit of contested space in Europe where Russia, China, America, the EU are all vying for influence. And because Russia has influence in the area, that is a massive problem for us in that regard. You know, this is where energy security, particularly for Hungary, for Slovakia, is important, but also for Serbia. And of course, all of this comes from Russia in that regard. The Chinese themselves is very much part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Serbs are buying military equipment from the Chinese, which causes all sorts of issues, but also selling vast amounts of equipment to the Americans that then goes to the Ukrainians. And lo and behold, that then upsets the Russians. So they are literally playing one side off another in a desperate balancing game, but there's a real danger that one of those legs of a three-legged stool could come away and the whole thing could disintegrate. Nationalism is returning to the region. Only if in July, 500,000 people gathered in Zagreb for a concert by effectively a neo-Nazi with fascist salutes and all the rest of it, which is causing concern within the EU for an EU country. Every football game between those nations results in violence and massive fines, because they simply can't get on in that regard. So all the ingredients for war or instability can all be found in the region itself, from, dare I say, lack of transparency, riots, particularly at the moment in Serbia, you know, religious conflict, but also refugees. And of course, this is where the refugees are coming through from Turkey and elsewhere, through the Balkans. As a bottleneck in the Balkans, because certainly Hungary and Croatia don't want to let them into the European Union. But in addition to the migration into the Balkans, there's mass migration out of the Balkans, huge depopulation that is causing all sorts of problems. You know, if we think about Serbia, probably the second largest raspberry exporter in the world, but they haven't got enough people to actually harvest the raspberries and realize the potential. And therefore, these countries are losing all sorts of opportunities. Because of all the wars, weapons are everywhere, particularly unlicensed weapons. And of course, these are getting into the hands of terrorist organizations or criminal gangs in Western Europe in itself. You know, drugs is also a massive problem. Also, the fear of terrorism. You know, when we look at Bosnia and Kosovo, they provide the largest number of volunteers to the Islamic State of any other nation by head of population in that regard. So disenfranchised youth is a massive issue in that regard. So when you have all these issues, like I mentioned, massive demonstrations in Belgrade against the current government, there's always an opportunity where it could horribly go wrong. So if you remember what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh recently, where the Azerbaijanis took back territory that was occupied by Armenians, that's the biggest fear. Could a snap operation suddenly take place with our view in Ukraine or in Gaza, taking our eye off the ball? Could that create all sorts of issues? And it's the Ukraine crisis that's having a massive impact, particularly on the region. Because Russia will play its hand in the Balkans now and certainly in the future, because whatever happens in Ukraine, the next fertile area for Russian interference absolutely is in that contested space there, where, like I said, there's a huge amount of influence and presence. Belgrade is full of Ukrainians and Russians who have fled the fighting. There's also a humanitarian center in southern Serbia, around the city of Niš, that simply doesn't react to humanitarian crises and has been accused of being a spy center. Half the Serbian oil industry is in Russian hands, and therefore they have a huge stake in that regard, let alone the Chinese. Therefore, at the moment, we're seeing effectively an arms race taking place in the Balkans, with all the countries basically increasing their spending. As it's Kosovo, 6%, because they fear the Serbs doing something similar to what the Russians did in Ukraine. And of course, the Serbian army is the largest force in that entire region and has the potential to basically take territory back in that regard. Recently, 2 NATO members, Croatia and Albania, signed a military accord with Kosovo. An attack against Kosovo potentially could bring them into the war. Therefore, NATO countries could find themselves theoretically at war with Serbia. What does that mean for Article 5 in terms of collective security? And therefore, it's a dangerous situation to suddenly find ourselves in. And to this day, in terms of the latest things that are going on, the Scots Guards have recently deployed there as a strategic reserve. Happens every year, but it's particularly happening now. All sorts of issues in northern Kosovo where the Serbs are, with places changing their names, bridges being built to basically overcome different obstacles. Serb political parties being banned, but then allowed to take part in elections in the next few months. Elections cause tensions. There's tensions in the Balkans because, regrettably, they're seeing the future quite starkly. The money tree is running out of money, and if the money doesn't come into the Balkans, they will certainly lose out in that regard. And then, lo and behold, in October, there's going to be another Western Balkans conference here in the UK. And remember, in October, there'll be a potential referendum for independence in Bosnia. Is it coincidental? Of course it's not. It's mischief, and that's exactly what the Balkans are about. So is it a powder keg? It could well be. And it would be fools not to keep our eyes on it in that regard.
We've got time for a couple of questions. And let me know if there's any coming over the Zoom.
I have overrun by 10 minutes. I do apologize.
If you could speak into this so that people can hear you online, that would be really great. Any questions for anybody? All completely shell-shocked.
Yes. I sent me lots of pictures.
Yep.
Oh, thanks very much. That's fascinating. With all you've said there, so as you can see, the region is split broadly across the same lines that it was between Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, with Slovenia, Croatia, etc., being incorporated into the EU and NATO, and the other sort of eastern countries of the Western Balkans looking more towards Russia. What do you think is the realistic possibility that the region will descend into violence and conflict again, being stirred up by the sort of this new age of great powers in the region?
To correct you slightly there, clearly some of those countries like Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia are also NATO members. Even Serbia, for example, is always accused of being an ally of Russia, is actually military neutral, and therefore the vast majority of its military exercises are with NATO countries. Only 3 exercises traditionally prior to Ukraine took place every year with the Russians, and so, if you ask any Serb where they want to be, it's certainly not in Russia's hands. They're desperate to join the EU. But the problem with the EU, there's enlargement fatigue. And therefore, if you look at the bar to join the EU, it's massively risen. And, certainly some of the countries in the EU would not be in the EU now if the same requirement was there in that respect. So the EU isn't doing itself any favors because it's giving those countries no other alternative. And therefore, if Serbia, for example, can't join the EU, if it can't buy weapons from EU countries or even ourselves, then where's it going to get its weapons from? So it's going to go to Russia. But if it then gets sanctions, as it would do by going to Russia, it's going to go to China or France, because they've recently bought aircraft from France. And so, yes, they look east, but they also look west. I think that the problem in the Balkans comes round to the fact that I think Patrick Sanders, in a recent podcast in his series, The General and the Journalist, said, countries go to war for 3 reasons: control of territory, control of people, and control of resources. And of course, everything you've heard this evening, it's about historic ties to territory and the security of peoples. And therefore, particularly in Kosovo, the Serbs really fear a repetition of what happened in 2004, where vast numbers of Serbs were driven out because of the start of the violence there in that year. And that's why, they've said we will not allow another expulsion of Serbs. And all it will take is a provocation that suddenly sees the Serbs going across the border. And that is a realistic scenario. Under the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 1244 that brought effectively the end of the war in Yugoslavia, there is a clause in there that allows approximately 1,000 Yugoslav forces, or now Serb forces, into Kosovo to defend patrimonial sites. And they always use this, if you can't defend our people, we'll go back in. And of course, that's going to be fiercely resisted by the Kosovars, hence why they're buying shed loads of drones and God knows what else, because they're learning the lessons as we are from Ukraine. If the Serbs in Bosnia try and go for independence, that's going to cause massive issues in Bosnia. And of course, they're using the presence of Kosovo. Well, if they can have independence, why can't we? What's really interesting there is that Serbia proper is saying that Kosovo can't have its independence because it's part of Serbia. And Serbia is a guarantor of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Bosnia. So Serbia itself won't probably allow the Bosnian Serbs to declare independence. Well, that's how they can then, leverage more rights for themselves. So the point is, it's a bit like what Bismarck said, and at the end of the day, it's going to take some silly little event that nobody sees that's going to probably start a domino effect in the region that no one's planned for. And that's the danger. And the problem is, it's how it's then perceived. And are the West willing to get involved? And, can they react quickly enough to prevent it from happening? Because the lessons from the Nagorno-Karabakh last year demonstrate that actually a lightning type operation, blitzkrieg, whatever you want to call it, can actually achieve its aims very, very quickly. And once you're on the ground, are we going to actually fight for it? Probably not in that reality. So a real risk. That's why it is a powder keg.
Over here.
Thank you. You spoke about how the territories that ended in a peace negotiation descended back into violence. If this is the case, how do you see Ukraine ending in a peaceful manner, but not descending back into violence? And if you can answer that question, you will be a millionaire.
I know, but I think this is the problem. I think we from the start of the invasion of Ukraine laid out our stall that we will not accept any occupation of territory, and all the territory had to be returned to Ukraine. And that's what the Ukrainians have staked their lives on in that respect. But as we saw in Bosnia, that was our language that we use for Bosnia. And then when the reality kicked in, fatigue kicked in, we forced the Bosniaks into an agreement they didn't want to sign. And I fear that's probably what's going to happen to Ukraine. And that's certainly what's coming out of the White House, the narrative in terms of territorial swaps, and all the rest of it. And therefore, even if that happens, any peace agreement is a compromise between. It's not, dare I say, what one side or the other wants. But for Russia, success will be clinging on to territory that it sees as important, which is clearly Crimea, and also obviously the Donbass, because that is, from a resources perspective, remember about territory, people, resources, where all the resources of Ukraine are physically, and that's what was the beating heart of the Soviet Empire in that regard. So there are lessons to be learned from Dayton. I just hope that our current politicians, diplomats, are going back into history 30 years ago to learn the mistakes that we made that to this day make Bosnia utterly dysfunctional. And I think we'll repeat the same mistakes again. That's the problem.